Hello, thank you for having me on your program.
Your previous novels have been described as experimental, postmodern, genre-bending, but this one seems to be fairly traditional historical novel, at least in terms of its structure. What happened? Did the book just the concept of the book just demand that?
It did. I found out about this what was to me an extraordinary place, Dejima, a trading post run by the Dutch East Indies Company for the whole of the 240 years that Japan was closed off to the outside world. But it ceased to be in the 1860s, so of course it had to be a historical novel.
Does it still exist?
It's being restored as a museum, Leonard, so if you do like the book, you can now get yourself to Nagasaki and walk the street if you wish.
Now, this is an island that was actually created so that foreigners would not walk on holy Japanese soil?
Effectively, yes. And I used the word island. It was, but not one with hills or woods on it. It was very, very small, just about a third of an acre, made in the same way that Amsterdam was, just you sort of hammer piles into the seabed, and so it's an artificial island, and it was walled. The Dutch weren't allowed off, and the only three types of people allowed on were the merchants to do the business, the translators, who and that was a father to some business that got passed down the generations, and apparently very, very expensive prostitutes.
Ironic that they were using a technique similar to what the Dutch did and only allowing the Dutch on this island.
Mm-mm.
Now, why the Dutch? Earlier, hadn't Portuguese missionaries gone to Japan?
Yes, indeed. The Portuguese and the Spanish, and they had converted large numbers of Japanese to Christianity, but this began to make problems to such a degree that, in fact, there was a sort of a Christian-fomented rebellion, and that really alerted the authorities to the dangers of this foreign religion. So almost like a virus, they wanted to keep it out of the country, and the walls went up. The Dutch, however, weren't interested in converting souls. They were just there for the money, and that was much more acceptable to the authorities.
Well, there'd been a long period of stability under the last shogunate. So was that part of it? They just didn't want to mess things up, keep things going the same as they'd been?
In a way, the long period of stability happened once the outside world was expelled. And this highly successful dynasty for the best part of 2.5 centuries ruled the roost, and in a way validated the original suspicion that if you want to keep control of power and to keep change out of the country, you have to very, very tightly control what's coming in and what's going out.
Your title character, Jacob de Zoet, is a young clerk with the Dutch East Indies Company. Did they really monopolize the trade? Why were they allowed, you said earlier, simply because the Japanese trusted them to only want to engage in trade?
The Japanese trusted them and the English. The English couldn't make it pay because they spent all the money, it would seem, on prostitutes and not on making money. They were given permission by the first shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and after his death he became deified. But because it had been him, it was impossible to overturn his word, and so the Dutch effectively had trading permission from God, and the power of tradition in Japan is very, very strong, and that was never challenged really until the 1840s, 1850s, time later.
We have this novel beginning in 1799, and it ends in 1817, so the change didn't... was Japan finally opened up to the rest of the world?
Starting in the 1840s and moving to the 1850s when the treaty ports were opened.
And then all hell broke loose and Japan became a modernized country within 50 years or so.
It did, in part because it had never really been in complete isolation because of Dejima. It always kept open this little cat flap into the outside world through which knowledge about what was happening and what happened to non-white countries that got too technologically far behind could enter Japan, which is really why it could go from being a feudal state in the 1860s through to something that could take on the Russian Navy and win in about 40 years. Extraordinary, really.
In the book, you include a wealth of detail about the sights, sounds, and even smells of the place, as well as the daily life of the men who lived there. How did you research this era? Did you find historical accounts? Were there letters or journals written by employees of the Dutch East Indies Company?
Yeah, just so. They're all kept at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and I went there and spoke with some archivists and some academics. That's the hard research, where you find things out for the first time you maybe can't find anywhere else.
And then you had to translate them. Or do you speak Dutch?
The Dutch speak excellent English, as you may know. And then, of course, when you're writing the book, you just to finish the end of a sentence, if someone's shaving himself, for example, you then have to go away and research when shaving foam was invented, or how would a middle-class man have shaved himself in 1799. So it never really stops until you finish the last sentence of the book, actually.
Poor Jacob is an honest and naive soul, and he has a hard time dealing with all the corruption and theft going on around him, both by the Dutch and the Japanese. Were things really as wild as you suggest?
Oh, yeah, I think they were more wild than I suggest, really. As a universal theme, what does an honest man do in a nest of vipers? Well, this was actually the year, on the stroke of midnight of 1799, the Dutch East Indies Company actually ceased to exist and had been. It was a long, slow death, but it happened because everyone in the organisation was on the take, except for a small number of poor souls who had kept it going as long as it did.
And I'm sure, and they were the ones who were treated with great suspicion. Somebody like Jacob. David Mitchell is my guest. His latest novel, The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, it is published in this country by Random House. It's interesting that the Japanese interpreters are some of the most powerful people on the island and also the most corrupt, because having the ability to translate between the two cultures gave them a form of political power as well.
It does. Language is power. There's Party A doesn't know what Party B is saying. Party B doesn't know what Party A is saying, and the translator's the bridge. And Party B won't know if the translator isn't telling the truth, is mistranslating.
So much of this novel is about the interaction of two cultures that don't always understand what the other one's about.
Almost never. In the beginning, I thought this would be a problem, but the more I got into writing the book, I realised this was a resource I could capitalise on.
Now, you mentioned the Dejima wives who were basically prostitutes, I guess. So how did they wind up on the island? Were they imported to act as girlfriends to these Dutch traders?
They worked for the best brothels in Nagasaki. They were the most expensive prostitutes in Nagasaki because the Dutch couldn't exactly go shopping to a cheaper establishment down the street. Often they were actually the daughters of previous unions between Dutch men and Japanese women.
So they'd be Eurasian in many cases.
Yeah, in many cases.
Did they ever get married?
It depends what you mean by marriage. No. They wouldn't be allowed to leave Nagasaki, so they couldn't really have an ordinary life.
Jacob is engaged to a girl back home, but he soon falls in love with not one of these women, but a young Japanese midwife who's studying with the Dutch doctor in Dejima. Were women able to study medicine in Japan at the time?
Probably not. However, that probably gives a novelist enough of just enough of a crack in the door to get his foot in. My wife warned me when I started writing the book. My wife happens to be from Japan, and she warned me that if I wrote yet another book where there's a beautiful, rather dim geisha who just swoons at the feet of someone who's tall and blonde and foreign just because they're tall and blonde and foreign, I can't really repeat what she on live radio, what she threatened to do to me, but it wouldn't have been pretty.